And finally, a columnist who's made such important and insightful contributions to the public discussion, E.J. Dionne.
First of all, I just want to say, Mr. Vice President, is Vice President Mondale still here? Oh, what I wanted to tell him, tell him I said it when he comes back. I just want to say Norwegian charisma always worked for me. And it's so good to have you here tonight. And Marty, I just want to say what an incredible privilege it is to speak tonight, really for the appreciation that all of us have for Tony, his life, his writing, his warmth, and his courage. And turns out we like some of the very same words, and as you will see tonight, because I think nothing could so honor Tony as his own words, and I'm going to share some of those with you tonight. But recent days, I think, have reminded us all of how much we miss his voice. I have been asking myself over and over again the essential question, what would Tony say? I miss knowing what Tony Lewis would say about the horror and outrage of the attacks on the innocents in Boston, a city he so loved. He felt an affection for and a connection to that city that so many of us here feel tonight. I also miss that Tony would have been the first to point out that Boston is the cradle of liberty. And being a very careful journalist, he would also note that Philadelphia battles Boston for that title. Tony would have insisted that deeply justified anger should never, ever, ever make us forget the rights guaranteed under our Constitution. He would insist, calmly but urgently, that protecting the rights of all of us, especially under the most difficult and challenging circumstances, is essential to protecting the rights of each of us, including our own. And he did that over the 10 years of the war on terror. Here's what Tony wrote about this in that last New York Times column. He said, "The men who met in Philadelphia in 1787 set out to create a nation from struggling states so distant from each other that it took 7 days for George Washington to learn that New Hampshire had provided the needed ninth vote to bring their Constitution into being. They wagered that a national government based on written rules could hold the country together. Intricate checks and balances, they reasoned, would prevent the abuses of power that tempt all politicians. They put their faith not in men, but in law, the law of the Constitution." I hope, forgive me for saying that I really wish Tony were around to comment on the morally obtuse refusal of the United States Senate to pass even a modest measure to expand I could be wrong, but I just have a feeling that in his very elegant way, he would have skewered him. And I also wish he were here to offer his views on what the Second Amendment actually means. I wish he were here to comment on so many other things, but we can be so grateful that he did raise his voice so powerfully in his path-breaking legal journalism that, as Jack noted, transformed the way the Supreme Court was covered in his books, especially Gideon's Trumpet that we honor tonight, especially and in the column he wrote for 32 years. He would actually, I think, disdain the title of Crusader because he'd probably remark on the historical difficulties of that particular term. But whatever word one uses, he was a battler on behalf of rights, particularly the rights of those who held unpopular views, the rights of the outcast, the rights of the ignored. As Jack mentioned, his first Pulitzer Prize in 1955, when he was 28 years old, was for a series of articles on Abraham Chazanow, a Navy employee unjustly accused during the McCarthy era, and Chazanow credited Tony Lewis's work for his vindication. That 63 Pulitzer citation, the 1963 Pulitzer citation, singled out the coverage of Baker v. Carr. And Jack was absolutely right that, in a way, Tony wrote Baker v. Carr. Adam Liptak noted, and I quote, "Mr. Lewis did more than cover the decision. An article on legislative apportionment that he had written for the Harvard Law Review was cited in the decision at footnote 27. I wish Tony were around now to cover the current forms of gerrymandering and our increasingly unrepresentative form of government. I would love it if he could provide another footnote 27 for a decision on this matter. I wish he were around to talk about filibuster abuse. I regarded doing justice to Tony's legacy as such a heavy burden that I knew I needed counsel, and I knew I couldn't count on the Supreme Court to guarantee it to me. So I called my friend Link Kaplan, another great friend of Tony's, and I said I wanted to share his thoughts tonight, and he kindly provided them, and I just want to share a few words from Link. Here's Link. He said, Gideon's trumpet is beautifully written, with a spare yet romantic eloquence. Anthony Lewis's prose provides a lesson about the power of storytelling and about the capacity of simple, direct writing to achieve a form of grandeur. Here is the opening of Gideon's trumpet. In the Morning Mail of January 8, 1962, the Supreme Court of the United States received a large envelope from Clarence Earl Gideon, prisoner number 003826, Florida State Prison, P.O. Box 221, Rayford, Florida. Like all correspondence addressed to the court, generally rather than to any particular justice or court employee, I went to a room at the top of the great marble steps, so familiar to Washington tourists. There, a secretary opened the envelope. As the return address had indicated, it was another petition by a prisoner without funds asking the Supreme Court to get him out of jail, another in the secretary's eyes because pleas from prisoners were so familiar a part of her work. She walked into the next room and put the envelope on the desk of an assistant clerk of the United States Supreme Court, and thus did history begin. To understand Tony's influence, Link went on, you might make two lists. The first would be those who came before him who seriously shaped the conception of journalism about law and its practice. And Link writes, there was no one on it. And then he writes, the second would be of those who came after, who have had a notable impact and who were strongly influenced by him. It is an impressive list in newspapers. It included Fred Graham, his successor at the Times and a shaper of television coverage of the court, and Linda Greenhouse, who covered the court superbly for the Times, and now Adam Liptak, its current and brilliant correspondent. The magazines includes Jeff Toobin at the New Yorker, Jeff Rosen at the New Republic, Emily Bazelon and Dahlia Lithwick at Slate. In broadcast journalism, it includes Nina Totenberg of NPR, and so many others that we have not. Link, I should say, any great court reporters call Link, because there are a great many others, but that is an excellent list, and they were all shaped by what Tony Lewis did. Anthony Lewis, he concluded, is generally credited with being the first journalist to report about Supreme Court opinions as statements at a moment in time about a long conversation regarding legal reasoning. He explained, as no one ever had in American journalism, the context and the consequences of court rulings. In Gideon's trumpet, he explained the enormous power of the Supreme Court through the power of public opinion when he called, quotes, the opportunity not to command, but to persuade. But the eloquence that he ascribed to the court was that much more so because of his own uncommon eloquence. The title of Anthony Lewis's book is from the book of Judges. But the Spirit of the Lord came upon Gideon, and he blew a trumpet, and so did Anthony Lewis. I want to close with words from that final column, written on December 15th, 2001. Thank God and thank Tony Lewis. He didn't stop writing after that final column, but I was struck by many of the same words. He wrote, I am an optimist about America, but how can I maintain that optimism after Vietnam, after the murder of so many who fought for civil rights, after the Red Scare, and after the abusive tactics planned by government today? I can because we have regretted our mistakes in the past, relearning every time that no ruler can be trusted with arbitrary power, and I believe we will again. The hard question is whether our commitment to law will survive
the new sense of vulnerability that is with us all after September 11. It is easy to tolerate dissent when we feel safe. But after all, this has always been a country of unbounded optimism, a country that struggles with itself and conquers corrupting habit. In my lifetime, we have carried out 2 revolutions, unfinished but extraordinary: the ending of racial discrimination and the move toward equality for women. 32 years ago, few imagined that the Secretary of State could be anything but a white male. In the end, I believe that faith and reason will prevail, but it will not happen automatically. Freedom under law is hard work. If rulers cannot be trusted with arbitrary power, it is up to citizens to raise their voices at injustice. The most important office in democracy, Justice Louis Brandeis said, is the office of citizen. And that's what Tony Lewis said. Tony blazed trails, and he inspired us as a writer and a moral voice. But above all, he was a model in living up to the obligations of a free citizen. And I think we should all follow his injunction about our obligations, and we should try to live up to his example. Thank you.